The body of Saint Comsil, wrapped delicate, light white cloth, was at the altar with Domnall on one side and Constantine the other. Both Alpine princes were on their knees, in prayer, as the saints' bones were brought to them, one by one. Though it was hard to follow all of the Gaelic, some was in Latin, which Osric knew, thanks to Father Bicker, and she sat in silence between Tagd and Domnall as the saint, akin to Cuthbert to the Northumbrians, was adored. In the warmth of the church and the odour of the incense, Osric's mind began to wander. She thought of the only story Bicker had ever told her of the saint. Columba appeared in a dream to King Oswald of Bernicia, and announced the king's forthcoming victory against the King Cadwallon of Wales in the Battle of Heavenfield against the pagan King Penda of Mercia. The people of Britain promised to convert to Christianity and receive baptism after the conclusion of the war. This victory signalled the re-Christianizing of pagan England, Bicker had concluded, closing the chapel's annals with a heavy thump. He had turned to Osric and added, and this established King Oswald as ruler of the entirety of Britain. Your ancestor. And, then, Bicker had glanced at the door, as if expecting Elfric to enter. He drew Osric forward by the shoulder, looking at her seriously and lowering both his voice and his shoulders. Remember that, Edra, he'd cautioned. Your ancestor ruled the Heptarchy. He already did what Elfrid of Wessex aspires to do. And that is why his niece, Oswy's daughter Osrith, chose to have his remains collected from the battlefield and buried in the Mercian monastery of Bardsey. He was as revered to the Mercians as Cuthbert was to the Northumbrians and Columba, Comsil, was to the Gaels. Osrith, her ancestor, whose name had come to mind when she had faced Maxenid ui Alpin that day, having rescued Constantine, had been so brave. Osrith, as Edra had read her story, how she had married the first King Ethliad, Penda's youngest son, as a political Northumbrian merchant pact to strengthen the one between her older sister and Ethliad's older brother, Wulfhere. But it didn't last, and the sons of Penda were regularly facing Osric's brother, Ecgfrith, on battlefields along the Northumbrian Mercian border. Yet she had been loyal to Mercia, and for that, had been murdered in revenge for her sister's betrayal of the Mercian nobility and had allowed assassins to do their worst on the royal family one fateful night. A tap on the shoulder brought Osric out of her memories. Domnall's voice was warm by her ear. We must be in guard duty now. Osric looked at the monks, who were still in mid-flow of the service. Domnall too looked like he hadn't moved since he had knelt there. Constantine too, was the stillest she had ever seen him. She got to her feet, Tagd and Fergus following her over the fresh, straw-strewn floors. Clearly no one was taking the praising of Comsil frivolously, a fact which was reinforced when no one stopped to look at them. Clearly it was vital to everyone that the service was to be carried out as intended. A few words between Domnall and one of the monks who had been on the earlier guard duty established the areas to watch. Norse had been spotted further north, so the harbour and the high ground were to be guarded, as the land facing the forest from the ramparts for anyone loyal to Eochaid and Giric. That was to be Osric's guard with two monks, her back to the sea and the cold Atlantic wind. She climbed the wooden steps, curling her feet around the planks to stop herself from slipping on the damp wood. Behind her, Domnall trod. He was to take the rampart at the northern end, where the wooden posts gave way to cold earth and now, dense fog. But first, he stood, 6 feet away from her, back to the wooden posts, his eyes west, to his homeland. Osric felt her heart soften. He was clearly as fearsome and determined for power as his cousins, and he had lost his position. 88,888,888. It was a long night, and for the passing of the cold air, nothing moved. The monastery was now lit with candles, whose light leaked out into the mist from its windows and doors, and Osric bided the hours by walking slowly around the inner palisade defences, waiting for attack, if there was to be one. The moon rose, and carried on rising, until it was overhead, its silvery light blending with the gold from the monastery's light, and she glanced over to the door, through which the procession of monks, led by the abbot, who were joining Domnall and Constantine. By the door, to the south, the light lit Fergus's flame-coloured hair, turning it silver, as the warrior stood stoically, reliably, in the damp of the night. To the east, Osrith knew, Tagd would be doing the same. How long did they intend to remain inside? Did it really take all these hours to get the saint's attention? A crack brought her attention to the cold, damp night, then another. Around the wooden ramparts, where monks were guarding, up high, a movement caught her attention. They had been attracted by something. The men hurried to the side of one who had flinched. Rain began to spat in big drops on Osrith's leather jerkin as she strode over the courtyard. The men were unable to see what caused the disturbance, for they moved left and right. Osrith stopped, hearing foot crunches softly on the damp earth beyond. "Domnall!" Osrith hissed, when she doubled back to where Constantine's cousin stood on guard, to the west, near the harbour. "Osrith!" His voice sounded surprised, and there was a warm tone to it that hadn't been there earlier. "I was about to find you." "Me?" Osrith felt surprised, and suddenly forgot why she sought him. "Come with me to the monastery for the night prayers. Domnall's service is still in progress. The guards won't miss us for a little time. We can add to the prayers to Combe. But," Osrith shook her head, to get her attention onto her reason of finding him. "There's intruders," she blurted out. "Someone at the north gate." Without hesitation the Irish prince sprang to his feet, pacing with her to the ramparts, then put an arm across her to stop her from moving when he, too, heard the sound of more than one pair of boots, of shuffling of people trying to be as quiet as they could. "Domnall!" Osrith hissed to Domnall, but the prince caught her upper arm. "They are still at prayer," Domnall reminded her. But she pointed, urgently, back the way she came. Domnall trod the damp, leaf-litter floor next to Osrith. They ran around the palisade until they reached the place underneath where she had been guarding. Large drops of water splashed down off the wooden surface and she held up a hand as the crunching and muffled voices were unmistakable. They were those of people trying their very best not to be heard. The ground tilted away between two shallow hills. These men knew what they were doing, where to hide for a surprise attack. Were they Norse? Likely, for there had been many yearly raids on the monastery. Yet the Norse would have often announced their arrival by now, frightening their enemies with show of strength before even raising an axe. Several words drifted upwards, many snippets of words, too indistinct to make out. It didn't sound like Norse, though. Some of the phrases caught on the wind and sounded Cymric and Gaelish. Cymric and Gaelish, Osrith thought. These were an alliance of different peoples of Alba, an alliance that were ambushing the holiest of monasteries at night, when Domnall, son of Constantine, grandson of Saint Mac Alpin, prayed for victory in St. Columba's house. How were they to do this? The ground sloped away, and the monks guarding the monastery had not accounted for such an hiding place to be occupied by a large force planning to attack. If there wasn't, they would be no worse off. Osrith pointed down, and Domnall nodded. He knew what she meant. AMD moved to the left, and over the rampart. He would bring the warriors to fight, to guard the weak point. Osrith looked about her. What could she do? She could fight, yes. She had Buey. But was there a way of surprising the attackers? Beyond the ramparts a cluster of half a dozen trees grew, huddled together as if warming themselves from the cold Atlantic winds that battered the island's coasts. If she climbed those, she might be seen. Ordinarily. It was dark enough that she would likely get away with. And her? She could only fight. Yet, her blade was in her scabbard. It would be a mistake to charge out without a coordinated force. Yet, they must do something. She scanned the land in the foreground. There it was, their mistake. It was a mistake to attempt to assault the monastery from where they were, for a rare yew tree, unusual for the Western Isles for them to even exist. Branches densely clustered despite there being only half a dozen or of them. The prevailing west coasterly winds had permanently battered them together, and though it was mid-November and the leaves had thoroughly left them, their packed tog-the-form should, offer cover. She kicked at the parapet, to get Domnall's attention, who turned his long neck from craning over the wooden wall down to monks in the courtyard, who tore off towards the chapel, hair plastered to his head by Thane, and looked at Osrith. She motioned to the trees and, after a few seconds, the prince nodded, understanding. As she began to climb, The rain Fergus predicted earlier that day fell on large globs all around them. She knew she must scramble up fast before the bark of the tree became slippery. Sticking a leg the other side of one of the pointed wooden overhang, Osrith reached out with an arm. Her fingertips touched the branch, but that was her longest reach. It was all she could manage, and she swept the water from her jerkin. There was only one way to manage it, Osrith knew. Ignoring a sharp, brief stabbing pain from her left inside muscle pulling, she got herself carefully onto the very edge. If she slipped and missed the jump she was about to make, she would plummet 50 feet. She closed her eyes, bending her knees, before launching herself at the boughs, the nearly set sun her only gauge, and caught hold of the soapy, stubby leaves of the yew branches. Her hands slipped through the branchlet spikes. Stopping her hands and clamping them together to stop her falling further, Osrith thrust her knees together, gaining a better grip. Voices, somewhere below, someone using the passage between the hills, filtered up to Osrith in her sparse canopy. A mixture of Gaelish and Celtic words rose up to her, as Osrith gripped the tree's trunk. They were moving. But where to? Then her mind drifted back to the night nearly 2 years before, that Finolai, at Eochaid's palace, had frantically aroused her from her sleep, to flee with Domhnall and Constantine and the rest of the warriors across the northern sea to Arion. The king's warriors had spoken a mix of both of those languages too, Gaelish, which Osrith was learning, and Cymric, the language of the Strathclydians, and their kin who lived south of the Roman wall in Cumbraland, where her mother was from. A descendant of Coelhen she had regularly whispered to Osrith when she was very young, and whose king was a Dane turned Christian. Her uncle Elfric would either have him in his pocket or, more likely, be at war with this King Guthard, for Bibbenberg claimed all of Northumbria as its own, even those lost by Ecgfrith to Bridi, as told by Tagged. Who were they? She wouldn't have to wait long to find out, though many would die under Domhnall's men's blades. Now Domhnall was alert, so they would hardly be able to be asked. But, Osrith suspected, they may be Gyric's men. Under the near full moon, its light shining occasionally through dense cloud, the group of men came to rest. Osrith could see their bodies huddling together, waiting, until one in front half rose, and beckoned, and then they were shuffling slowly over the blunt grass making a quiet, scritching sound. Osrith made to put her hand out to grasp Buail. She followed the scritch as it made its way towards the wall of the monastery, wobbled, then seized the wood again. They were heading, she reasoned, to the back of the monastery, where the buckets of soil waste were taken by the novices. Were they intended to assail the postern, hoping it would be undefended? She hoped Domhnall had collected the men, hoped he had sent 2 or 3 scouts out to find out what she had inferred. Then, as Osrith would, regroup and organize an assault, throwing all the warriors at the enemy. She listened and watched. But no sign of assault came, no warriors were coming as she looked behind her, only the moonlight illuminating the strong timber walls. Osrith's hand twitched towards her sword. She would be there, now. She would be on top of them, fighting now, fighting with her warriors, defeating them. She waited. Where was Domhnall? And closed her eyes, listening. Little sound drifted up to her, not voices, Gaelish, Cymric or otherwise, no steps of the guards on the walls. No service. That was quite clear, the monks were no longer chanting their prayers. She waited, rain dripping a regular rivulet down her neck. And the enemy below waited. Until they moved. A crackle of small rocks moved under feet. And then there was a crack beneath her hands. Osrith knew in her mind that she should not have reached for her sword. But, impatience was too strong in her and she moved. The yew tree yawed at her shifted weight, then, presumably, the branch she was holding must have succumbed to rot, for after it cracked suddenly, the rain-smoothed wood crumbled in her hands. Osrith fell, knowing she was going to injure herself if she fell badly against the nice rocks jutting out from the short, stubby grass, not a nice fall. But she didn't. Instead, she landed on something softer. A loud yell followed shortly afterwards, and Osrith found her thrown off the back of one of the invaders, Buail slamming into her leg. Scrambling up, she stepped back onto another, who pushed her hard onto the rocky earth. Chaniluk Belash. Nothing but a boy. He growled, trying to grab at Osrith. But, uninjured, she had scrambled up, abandoning her search for the handle of Bue and launched herself at the first man, with fists and feet. There was no one else, Osrith thought. It caught the man off guard. He dropped his sword, swiping thick arms at Osrith, who dodged them. From behind her, another warrior made to attack her, but she ducked and the warrior hit the other man in the face. Osrith backed away, rising to her feet, this time hand feeling for Bue about to withdraw the blade. In the darkness however, she was thrown to the damp ground again, a weight of a man landing on her arm, squashing the air in her lungs as her hilt slipped out of her grip. Osrith spluttered, flailing, then found a groin, kneeing as hard as she could. The man reared back, and Osrith moved out of the way, staggering back to find her feet. Attack, her brain told her. Delay as many of these men as she could. Give Domhnall time to bring the warriors. She swung round, as the first man had found his feet again, and, in the intermittent moonlight, Osrith saw a hand raised. In it a striped rock glimmered. Osrith dived, feet slipping on the now muddying ground as the rain began to set in. She flung herself away from the rock's trajectory, which was clearly intended for her head, scabbarded sword swinging wildly against her leg. Get low, she knew, arms tight, head close to, and she could bring down anyone no matter their size. The rock flew from the man's hand as he landed hard on an outcrop of rocks, the noise of metal reverberating into the night's air as Bue smashed onto the ground. It was enough to stall him, though, as Osrith bent low and dived towards his legs, driving forwards and squeezing them together at the calves, her left hand clasping out, trying to grip his breeches, and failing to hold onto him properly. Her foot slipped, and they both came crashing down, Osrith's face receiving the thrusts and punches of the man's flailing hands. Behind her, the second enemy pounced towards her, but Osrith had seen his shadow in the moonlight. She turned, determination stealing her stomach, and she plunged on to fight. Last time, it was for the Royal Uineal children, the time before fighting Domhnall's man for her sword, who had been killed at the monastery battle. Flinging up her arm, she aimed a blow at the second man, regaining her feet, but missed, and now the first man was on his feet. She would have to fight them both, Osrith thought. It was dark at least, though the ground was treacherous. But she was wrong. Before anyone could pull her off, or fight her, through the postern gate warriors burst, a storm of screams and visceral howls. The beginning of all Gaelish attack. Began the battle, swords of all lengths and thicknesses, cudgels and axes flying in the direction of the enemy. Domhnall, Osrith thought, relief trickling through her mind. Though she might have held off two, maybe even killed them, there were more than two. Who now revealed themselves. Swords matched swords, axes, spears, short daggers all appeared. Domhnall had the advantage, both of surprise and number, for though the Sage was without warning, he had sufficient time to field a counter-attack. A blow to the arm brought Osrith to her senses as bodies squelched around her in the muddy earth, and not for the first time she wished she had a short blade, a seax, for use at close quarters. She turned, using both hands in a bold stroke to thrust Bue towards her assailant, running him through. She felt the man behind her pause, his feet unmoving rather than pursuing her. Osrith hauled her blade out of the man's body, then, with all her might, swung it round to the first man, who was definitely standing, motionless, before her. The trunks of the twisted yews were behind him, and she backed him towards it, sword levelled at his neck. And, somehow, she could see his face, clearly, as if the moon was now full, on a cloudless night, his small nose visible with his wide face, wrinkled forehead and deep-set eyes, thick neck set into a sturdy body, which now looked at Osrith with hatred. Behind her, the noise of battle had ebbed. Osrith glanced to one side, emphasizing the man's predicament by poking the tip of Bue a little closer to his neck sinews. The fighting had stopped. Not only that, Domhnall and the warriors, monks and servants had lowered their weapons. They were staring at her, lanterns in hand. Presumably the enemy had surrendered, Osrith thought, and she sought out the abbot, or the captain of the monastery's lean guard. Then, her eyes lit on Domhnall. He was standing next to his cousin, his other cousin to his left. Constantine was staring at her intently. She heard the man she had at sword point shift his feet. Osrith jerked her head back and glared at him, redoubling her threat. "Am I to kill this old man, my lord?" Osrith called to the king. "What is this, Domnall?" The man called plaintively, sending this puny streak of rat's piss to do a man's job. But he did not continue, for Osrith pressed Bué closer to the man's throat. She watched as Domnall strode across the sodden earth across to there. He looked at Osrith and put his hand to Bué's pommel. "Not today, Osrith," Domnall replied, pushing the sword away from the man, and was astounded when they clapped an embrace on one another's back. "Greogr Macdungal, old man," Domnall declared, then shook his head. "You are glad your men recognized Constantine, or my warrior here would have skewered ye with her mighty fine blade here." As with my kinsman, Greogr scowled a foul look at Osrith, before glancing down at their dead man, his blood congealing at his stomach washing clean of his body in the rain. And the two allies strode together back into the monastery, as Greogr Macdungal turned, looked at the dead man on the floor by her feet, then drew his eyes level to Osrith.